Fire in the Sky, the horrifying tragedy of Air Canada. Flight 797, on June 2nd, 1983, what began as a routine flight from Dallas to Montreal via Toronto, turned into one of the most terrifying and tragic events in aviation history. Air Canada Flight 797, a McDonnell Douglas DC-932, carried 41 passengers and 5 crew members. Nothing in the early moments of the flight suggested anything was wrong. The skies were mostly clear, and the aircraft was cruising smoothly at 33,000 feet. But deep within the rear lavatory of the plane, an invisible danger had already begun to smoulder. What followed would be a desperate fight against time, smoke, and fire. A fight that ended in a horrifying blaze on the runway and a loss that forever changed airline fire safety standards around the world. The first sign that something was wrong came roughly an hour and a half into the flight. The pilots noticed a strange electrical malfunction. Circuit breakers for the lavatory kept popping, and cabin lights flickered. At first, the flight crew believed it was a minor issue, and continued flying towards their destination. But things quickly worsened. Smoke began seeping into the cabin, noticed by a passenger near the rear lavatory. The flight attendants attempted to investigate and reported to the cockpit that there was smoke and possibly a fire in the aft lavatory area. Still, the source remained elusive. The thickening smoke made it nearly impossible to see or breathe. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. In the cockpit, Captain Donald Cameron and First Officer Claude Ouimet understood they were dealing with a serious emergency. The decision was made to declare an emergency and divert immediately to the nearest airport, Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky International Airport. The aircraft began a rapid descent as the smoke intensified, pouring through the cabin. Flight attendants did their best to calm passengers and instruct them on emergency procedures. Oxygen masks were not available in the cabin since they are not designed for smoke inhalation, only for loss of cabin pressure. Passengers began covering their faces with clothing to shield themselves from the toxic fumes. As the DC-9 descended, the cabin grew darker, filled with choking black smoke. The flight attendants, including the brave chief purser, Sergio Benetti, moved among the passengers despite the worsening conditions, urging them to prepare for an emergency landing. In the cockpit, the pilots were struggling to see their instruments and maintain control. Communication was reduced due to the malfunctioning electrical systems. Every moment became a desperate race against the flames now consuming part of the rear fuselage. With only minutes to spare, the pilots managed to bring the aircraft safely onto the runway in Cincinnati. Emergency vehicles were already in position as the plane came to a halt. The flight attendants sprang into action, opening emergency exits and deploying slides. Smoke billowed out of the open doors as passengers scrambled to escape. Some were able to flee quickly, while others were disoriented and overcome by the dense smoke. Within 90 seconds of landing, the fire erupted violently. A flashover, a sudden explosion of flame due to superheated gases, engulfed the cabin, making survival impossible for those still inside. Of the 46 people aboard, 23 managed to escape. Tragically, 23 others died, including many who were overcome by toxic smoke just moments before reaching safety. The fire's source was never definitively determined, but it likely started due to an electrical malfunction in the lavatory. What is known is that the fire smouldered for too long before it was detected, and the toxic fumes, along with delayed emergency response inside the plane, contributed heavily to the death toll. In the days that followed, the tragedy of Flight 797 shook both Canada and the United States. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board and Canadian aviation authorities combed through the wreckage. What they found was sobering. The aircraft's interior materials, including seat cushions and wall panels, produced deadly smoke when ignited. Emergency lighting had failed in some areas. There were no smoke detectors in the lavatory. Worst of all, the fire had quietly spread unnoticed for too long before being discovered. The findings prompted immediate changes in aviation safety protocols. Regulations were introduced requiring smoke detectors in aircraft lavatories and automatic fire extinguishers. New materials used in airplane cabins were required to be fire retardant and produce less toxic smoke. Floor-level emergency lighting was mandated so that passengers could find exits even when the cabin was filled with smoke. These reforms would later prove critical in saving lives in future in-flight fire emergencies. One of the most heroic stories to emerge from the tragedy was that of Sergio Bonetti, the flight attendant who gave his life while trying to help passengers escape. Witnesses said he remained in the aisle near the rear of the aircraft, guiding people to exits even as smoke and fire surrounded him. He perished in the blaze, but his bravery became a symbol of selfless service and dedication. For the survivors, the memory of that terrifying night would never fade. Many recounted how quickly the situation escalated from a mild concern to a deadly inferno. Survivors described crawling through the aisle on hands and knees, trying to stay below the smoke, or jumping through emergency exits with flames licking at their heels. Families of the victims demanded answers and reform, and their voices helped bring about one of the most significant shifts in airline fire safety in modern history. Air Canada Flight 797 stands as a chilling reminder of how quickly disaster can strike at 33,000 feet. But it also marks a turning point. Because of the lives lost that day, future passengers would fly on planes that were safer, better equipped, and more prepared to handle in-flight fires. Today, smoke detectors, improved cabin materials, and stricter fire response protocols are standard on every commercial airliner, all because of the lessons learned from that tragic night. More than 4 decades later, the legacy of Flight 797 lives on, not just in the regulations it inspired, but in the stories of survival, heroism, and change. It reminds us that every safety measure taken today was built on the lessons of the past, often paid for in the most painful way possible. Though those who perished aboard Flight 797 are gone, their memory remains etched in aviation history as catalysts for a safer future.